We Love History Live. I'm Neil Gregory from Historic Environment Scotland, and whilst we're in lockdown, myself and my colleagues, we want to give you an insight into our work, investigating, recording, finding out and promoting Scotland's history, archaeology and architecture through these live stream events. If you've got a YouTube account or a Gmail account, you can actually take part today and post up your questions. And we'll try and answer as many as we can during the next half hour. Today, I'm joined by my colleague, Dave Cowley. He's an archaeologist and he's an expert in interpreting Scotland's landscapes. And what I really love about his job, one of the aspects of it, is that he takes to the air and he takes photographs from above Scotland. He gathers this information together and he finds out all sorts of things that we simply just couldn't find out from the ground. The data that he discovers goes into the National Record of the Historic Environment, and you can find out more of his work by going on to canmore.org.uk, and there's lots of photographs and lots of information there that you can explore. So welcome along, Dave.
Thank you, Neil.
Hi there. Dave, I wondered if you could tell us, talk us through maybe a day in the life of what happens on a day when you're going to go flying.
Well, you've already made it sound very glamorous, and as you'd expect, there's more to the job than just taking to the air, but it's a fundamental part of the work, and you can see the kind of type of aircraft we use there on the screen, a small high-winged aircraft like a 172. And the important point to make about this, I think, is that the flying is just a proportion of a year's work. It's very, very important. And as you might expect in a country like Scotland, getting things like the weather and so on right is always a major issue. But when everything comes together and you get a cracking day, this is the type of aircraft we take to the air in. And you can see in the view of pilot Ronnie Cowan and myself with our backs to the screen there, it's very crowded. For those of you of a certain vintage, think about a 1970s Mini with wings at 2,000 feet. So that's the nuts and bolts of it. You go looking for stuff. When you see it, you tip the aircraft over in a left-hand orbit, pop the window, take your photographs, and then carry on your way. And we probably do something like 120 hours flying in a year. Myself, my colleague Robert Adam, Kirsty Milliken, and others. And what I wanted to really stress is that every hour we spend in the air generates many hours or days of work undertaking analysis and mapping. And the image that you've got in front of you now or shortly shows some mapping work done by my colleague Georgina Brown using a digital surface model that was generated from aerial photographs of Hume Castle in the Borders. And the UAV flying for that might have taken a few hours. The work that went into the interpretation and the production of that plan, days, if not weeks of time.
Mm. And so in a day then, Dave, how long are you actually up in the air for?
You're limited to 4 hours at a time because of fuel and endurance of the aircraft. And quite often, depending on kind of turbulence and weather conditions, that's absolutely more than enough. Thanks very much. But occasionally we might do up to 6.5, 7 hours at a time.
Wow. Because both my mum and my brother both have 1970s Minis, and I get pretty car sick in both. I imagine it's perhaps not suited to everybody to be up in the air.
It's not ideal for everybody, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you would be airsick, because I think you're moving in unison with the aircraft quite a lot.
Okay, yeah, definitely got used to it. Tell me a little bit about the different types of aerial photographs you can take, because I'm aware that there are ones where you get different information depending on how you take them.
Yeah, and we're not taking all of the photographs, but for example, the image there that you've got of Loch Tay looking across to the west there, that's a classic example of an oblique view that you've taken looking at an angle across the landscape, which is, you get the saying that a picture's worth 1,000 words, and that information is packed, that picture is packed with information about contemporary land use, the past, and so on. And the great thing about aerial photography is that it allows you to move seamlessly from that kind of very general view that captures a loch in its landscape to a very, very specific view where you're right on top of, for example, Includen Abbey down near Dumfries there, and you get that very, very detailed view of a site. And both those images have been taken from about 2,000 feet. And ultimately, I don't care where I get my aerial photographs from, whether I've taken them, somebody else has taken them, whether they're taken from an aircraft, whether they come from a satellite, or as we see with the image that shows you the little island in a loch on the Western Isles, you've got a really nice example of the incredibly detailed view of a monument that you can get using a UAV or a drone, that one taken by George Geddes. So it's really kind of a horses for courses, what you're trying to work out, what you're trying to do. And I mean, that multi-scale view of the landscape, I mean, we're all familiar with things like Google Earth. With the roll of your mouse, you can look at something in detail or you can zoom back out again. And the image that you've got there shows a bit of the borders, a type of image that you would see through Google Earth, which shows how effective the imagery is for giving you that landscape texture. You can see which fields have been ploughed, which haven't, where the forestry is, and so on. And that's what I find really, really fascinating about this, is that ability to move from the detail to the general, backwards and forwards seamlessly.
Yeah, it is fascinating, isn't it? Because you've got one picture that can tell a lot of stories, but when you actually combine them all together, you do get that full appreciation of the landscape and how it changes throughout your flight and throughout an area. I'm always particularly fascinated when I learn from you about crop marks and the fact that actually with crops growing at different heights, you're able to actually sort of tease out what's under the ground and what you simply couldn't see if you were going for a walk. But it is interesting about the weather, isn't it? There's days you can't fly. There's days you've got to spring into action because it's a great day. When you're out and about, how does the weather impact on what you're capturing?
I'll come on to that in 30 seconds, but I just wanted briefly to show people an image of the Ring of Brodgar up on Orkney, a grayscale image, which is another type of imagery that we're collecting or creating from airborne laser scanning. And essentially that allows us to view the landscape in a way, creating images, but relying on these airborne laser scanning data sets, which we'll come back to later. But just going back to your question then about the impact of the weather. You've got there a picture, green, there's a field boundary running across the middle of it with trees along it, and you're probably seeing a kind of almost like a grill radiator pattern of greens and yellows on the screen there. And that's the differential crop growth in an arable crop that's revealing the presence of the Roman roads, walls and ditches at the fortress down at Newstead in the Borders. And this is one of the kind of things where aerial archaeology is such a game changer, that it allows us to get airborne and to capture these crop markings that show buried archaeology, completely invisible otherwise, and which may only be there for a week or two at a time when we get a really dry summer. Summer 2018 was a cracking year for that kind of condition. The heat to really stress the crops and produce those markings.
And that really attracted a lot of interest, didn't it, in the national news that year, because the summer was so hot. You know, I remember seeing pictures south of the border of knot gardens that had been exposed for the first time in perhaps a generation. I don't remember exactly, but certainly it really is fantastic for discovering these things, isn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, those kind of things which you see in a fleeting moment of time and are then taken away by the ripening of the crop, or the crop being taken in to make wheat or whatever. You also get that pattern, and we've done a lot of work flying up the west coast, for example, looking for features in shallow water and in intertidal zone. And you've got there a lovely aquamarine sea with a kind of back to front C shape sitting in there. And that's the broken down remains of an intertidal fish trap, essentially a stone and wood wall built. Not sheep live on land, it's fish I'm talking about. The fish come in and then obviously get trapped behind it, and you can go and harvest them. And these things are scattered all up the west coast. And the airborne perspective, allowing you just to kind of go and look into the bays, the nooks and crannies, and find these things, which would be pretty unintelligible on the ground, is another really good example of how powerful the aerial perspective is.
Sure. And you've not, as well as taking images of rural Scotland, capturing our towns and cities. Urban growth is something as well that you can do with aerial photography, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, and so there's really no aspect of what we call Scotland's historic environment that doesn't really benefit from that aerial imagery. And we've got two examples of an archaeological site, Woden Law down in the borders, a kind of Iron Age hill fort. And the one that you're looking at now, where you can see the multiple ramparts, just highlighted by a low raking winter light. You see how important, for example, the time of day is in taking the images, because there we've got really quite subtle shadows throwing up an archaeological feature.
Yeah.
And one of the great things about aerial photography is if you've got images from multiple conditions. And so on this next image, which is also Woden Law, exactly the same site, but it's taken with a light snow covering. And by comparing the two images, you get slightly different information, one from the shadows, another one from the differential snow melt. And taking it back to your point about the urban areas, we've been taking photographs, or people have been taking aerial photographs of Scotland since the 1930s. So we have these incredibly rich sources of how our landscapes, our urban areas and so on have changed enormously. And they give you a detail that you don't get on a map, for example.
Yeah, they really do. And from my own research in architecture, seeing new towns develop and seeing engineering achievements, seeing the Forth Crossing as it was built in different phases is really rewarding when you look at it with the archive imagery of the other road crossing and, of course, the rail bridges as well. Dave, I wondered if you could tell me a little bit about your current project that you're working on. This is the Rapid Archaeology Mapping Program, isn't it?
Yeah, so I already mentioned the airborne laser scanning, or also known as LiDAR, which is essentially this massive cloud of digital points that have been collected by an airborne laser scanner, which, guess what, is a laser scanner mounted on an airplane. And we use that raw information to create digital surface models that allow us to look at the landscape in incredible detail, pull out all the humps and bumps, the remains of archaeological features. And Scotland's taken a big step forward in this, with the Scottish Government acquiring really quite extensive coverage of the country, which you can access through the Scottish Government remote sensing portal, in which you see a map. A lot of it's concentrated into the river valleys, but we've now got quite extensive coverage in southern Scotland.
Mm.
And this is, people talk about game changers, but this really is a big, has massive implications for how we do our archaeology, because it's giving us this incredibly powerful, easily manipulated, information-rich source of information. And the project that we're working on at the moment is really to have a think about how the advent of this digital technology, what implications it has for how we work, the types of routines we work through. And we did a trial of this on Aaron a couple of years ago, which generated a reasonable amount of press coverage as well. And you see on the image that's just popping up now, a group of prehistoric roundhouses and field clearance heaps, 2,500, 3,000 years ago perhaps, preserved in the surface topography, but really punched out into high relief by this airborne laser scanning data. And just to give you an idea of the potential impact that this has on our understanding, the map that you see of Arran has got a whole load of multicolored dots on it. I think the main point that I wanted to make with that is that our survey more than doubled the number of archaeological monuments known on Arran, so added 900 odd previously unknown monuments to the archaeological record available through Canmore, which weren't known before. And this is not an unfamiliar part of the country to archaeologists. So, and that really points to the potential of this information to really develop our understanding of Scotland's past.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dave. But just a reminder to everybody, if you do have a question for Dave today, do get involved. You can either just type your question straight into YouTube, or if you have a Gmail account, you can do that as well. So post up your questions and we'll try and answer them if we can. If you think about something afterwards, don't worry. Put your question up, because we will be looking at it over the next few days, and we will get back to you if there's something that you're curious about. Dave, I thought maybe for the rest of the conversation we might focus a little bit on perhaps some of your favorite experiences, your favorite discoveries up in the air. Is there anything that comes to mind?
Okay, there's two things I'm going to talk about with that briefly. One is actually one of the outcomes from Arran, where you'll be maybe seeing a picture with a lot of multicolored, what are they, blue, red, and green squares on them. And this is something, a development, which is about using artificial intelligence and machine learning to help us to better look at the data and to be able to work 24/7. So there's a big challenge when we get these big data sets like the LiDAR that allow us, how do we explore this information in enough detail, really to do it justice? And we've had to put some quite interesting preliminary work done, which has really pointed to the benefits of incorporating artificial intelligence and machine learning in our kind of detection routines to speed up what we do and make our coverage much more effective. So that's been a kind of slow burn bit of excitement, but I think has a massive potential to change the way that people like I work, and is a key part of this development that we're doing.
Sure.
But you asked more specifically about kind of favorite experience in the air, and anybody who flies over Scotland is going to tell you that the Scottish landscape, with the endlessly variable weather, the qualities of the light and so on, is just, it's a constant source of fascination, because everything changes all the time. But I have to pick out one image. So I've picked out one image taken during the winter a few years ago of Torridon. Even though I say so myself, I think it's a cracking image.
It is.
Myself on the back for that one. But what this kind of image captures for me is that these aerial photographs are sources of information and stories that you can keep going back to. So you see massive time depth in there. There's the geological processes, there's the weathering of the mountain, there's the big kind of debris cone, I think they call them, which comes down and creates that kind of shallow C shape across the bottom. And you can see all the water erosion in there. you're seeing process, you're seeing stuff happening
Sure.
in that context, geological time, but you've then got the way in which the village there has picked up the bottom of this ancient geological feature. And the landscape, its geology, the soft bits, the hard bits, and the people are all kind of interacting and creating this incredibly rich story about what people and the landscape of how they've interacted over time. And that's the fascinating thing about the aerial perspective for me, is it really provides that rich, textured, long time period source of history and the telling of Scotland's story, if you like.
Yeah, absolutely. Even for those of us who haven't studied archaeology, you just get that deep, almost spiritual, if you like, appreciation of our ancestors. We've got a question, Dave, from Julia, and she wants to know, how often do you spot an interesting feature on your way to somewhere else, and do you ever go back and investigate it?
Yeah, that's a nice question. So whenever you're going out to do a particular job, you always want to be alert to that potential to see the unexpected. So my short answer would be absolutely routinely. And I think some of the interesting things that we've found over the years have almost happened by accident. And there's a nice example of a large Cursus monument on Arran, just near Macri Moor, which we found.
What's a Cursus monument, Dave? What do you mean by that?
It's a big Neolithic enclosure, probably in the order of 5,500 years ago. Okay. We're not entirely sure what they're for, but so, as archaeologists usually do, we suspect there's something to do with ritual. But this feature is about 1 kilometre long, and I'd been looking at the airborne laser scanning LiDAR data for a while on screen, and it was only when I printed out some of this stuff and looked at it at a distance that I noticed this incredibly subtle, but nevertheless very big, very long feature. So I think the point is, yeah, you never know what you're going to see when you pop into either the air or trawling around on Google Earth.
Absolutely. Absolutely, and I'm guessing you've visited some areas in the aeroplane many times now, for different reasons as to sort of why you're flying and whatever.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we've just about come to the end of our discussion. Dave, thank you so much for talking today. It really is, I think it's a very fascinating area of our work, and you'll maybe if people watching today, you'll have heard some of the stories that we've of our discoveries from the aeroplane on the BBC website and so on. Just one thing that I also sort of remembered, Dave, is the fact that obviously you're in contact with people from other countries that are doing this work as well, aren't you? It isn't something that's just exclusive to Scotland and indeed England.
No, yeah, we're quite a community of aerial archaeologists, and we try and learn from each other. It's always interesting to get somebody else's perspective. And what I would say, referring back to the image of Torridon that you've got in front of you at the moment, is that actually fairly uniformly people are kind of envious of our landscapes, and I think it's, we're familiar with them, but Scotland's landscapes really are stunning and incredibly rich.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Well, thank you very much. Now, if you enjoyed this event today, do keep an eye out on the Historic Environment Scotland social media streams and find out about future events. Be aware as well that during lock time, unfortunately, we can't open our properties in care, but we've got a whole host of things online for you to enjoy at the moment, whether it's actually resources to work on with your children. There's lots of fun activities online at the moment that we've recently posted up for this lockdown period. There's also exhibitions as well. And we're talking to Dave today because it coincides with our Scotland from the Sky exhibition that you can enjoy on the Historic Environment of Scotland website. So thank you very much, and do come and join us again for one of these We Love History live events in the future. Thank you.
Bye-bye.